Hi, welcome back. I'm Terry Burns, and this is a continuation of my course on the Monas Hieroglyphica or Hieroglyphic Monad of Dr. John D. And this is a conclusion of the part of the class that is actually looking specifically at the Monas Hieroglyphica itself. Way back before we started the letter to Maximilian, I said I'd also be doing some follow-up videos on other things. I'll have a separate video out in a couple days talking about that. But since we have made it all the way through the 24th theorem, I want to look at that final chart in Theorem 23 that I gave you for homework. I also just wanted to say thanks. When I started this project, I had no idea that I would wind up with this many viewers. I figured this was just, to be honest, something that I wanted to get out there before I die or something like that. So I've really enjoyed having so many of you ask such neat questions, come up with things I had never thought of, and I hope I get to meet some of you in person down the road before, as they say, this dance ends. But what I want to do here is just look at that last chart and explore it a little bit, because what I think is most useful about that chart is not kind of a multiple choice test or something. It's a habit of mind. How skilled have you become in flipping from one paradigm of thought to another with making correspondences? Because that's really one of the beauties of the things you can do with the Monas Hieroglyphica. I personally think, though I have no way of proving it, that it's that kind of habit of mind that later allowed the so-called Enochian work that Dee and Kelly did to come through. And be that as it may, there also are some answers. What, how can we put this? There are many right answers and some wrong answers to how we would look at that chart. So that's what we're going to talk about. If for some reason someone is just joining now at this last class, we've already talked about the context, the whole letter to Maximilian and letter to the printer, and all 24 theorems. The reason we're jumping back to 23 now is that theorem 24 basically places you in the book of Revelation, as Dee did in Theorem 20, and doing that suggests some numbers we might not have thought about before, unless you thought about them when we were in Theorem 20, for example. So I've assumed that you know who John Dee is, you know what the Monas Hieroglyphica is, and now I'm just hoping that you understand the Monas Hieroglyphica, because that's been the whole point of this course. It's been one of the joys of my life translating it and then getting to share it with all of you. So, like I said, we'll look at the other supporting materials and things you can do with the monad later on, but just a quick recap about Theorem 23. We went through Dee's drafting instructions, remember? Here's the one from his 1564 Antwerp edition. This is the 1591 Frankfurt edition. Then we saw how you could draft it and make it prettier. Someone can follow the drafting instructions if they're familiar with compass and straight edge drafting. They don't need to understand the whole monad. Then he launched into this first chart in Theorem 23, one that, as we discussed in the class on that chart, that he no doubt assumed that an educated humanist of his era, or at least one who was interested in looking at the theorems the way he's describing them, mathematically, magically, anagogically, and Kabbalistically, could understand. So that quaternary we found wasn't that difficult. Then we have his artificial quaternary. And we've talked about how artificial, when he uses that word, means by art, in the way that Plato makes much of the ancient Greek term techne, a skilled art or skilled craftsman. So we saw what he was doing in that one. And if you want to review again, that's in the earlier video. Then we went into his third chart, where there were some numbers I didn't explain, like 25 here and 13, that I want to look at in terms of what he is saying here is synthetic. And there we had his number of the Philosopher's Stone, 252, come back. And you know why he's using that as the Philosopher's Stone, because if you've been studying along, we've looked at that several times. So, but if you're just dropping in, it's not a secret. It's the 3 different kinds of letters of the Hebrew alphabet multiplied. He has become so accustomed to using physical alchemy as a metaphor, or the terms from alchemy, whether physical or not, that when he gives those in Latin, he just abbreviates them as if you're going to know what these mean. Also, I talked about how some of these fraction descriptions that he gives have words in ancient Greek that we don't have in English, so you got that longer translation. But that brings us to this final chart. And that's what we're going to look at here next. So take a look. You've tried to figure it out on your own and no doubt come up with many answers. If there are some things that I don't talk about here, and I am certain there will be, please comment below. I'll answer any um, solution you have there, because really we could go on and on about this for hours, but I think that sort of defeats the point. The point is to become kind of mentally nimble at this particular type of thinking that he's using here. Okay, by now you've become very aware of the difference of what it means when the monad is flipped and when it's right side up. So when it's flipped, the world is being formed, whether we are interpreting that Kabbalistically or in terms of the cosmogenesis in Plato's Timaeus, or maybe we're looking at it just as biblical Genesis, just as the fall. Actually, as you well know, he's laid all three of those contexts over each other. So when you see this up here with 4, that is, again, what that means. From that, many things can follow. The consummation line here, we've talked about the divine marriage, merging with the divine, hieros gamos. So that's what the consummation and metamorphosis is here. Now, if you try to think the way that sometimes we're encouraged to think, like when we do taxes, a number means only one thing and we can't flip numbers and all of that. But so if you see 4 there, oh, Kabbalistically, that must be the fourth world. No, the fourth world, the world of Messiah, the world of action, the one where time exists, could not possibly be that one. And you understand by now why. So note that he is running this now, has 1, 2, 3, 4 getting bigger and bigger. This is, in effect, flipped the sequence of numbers too. And you can do that with other sequences here, right? If down here darkness is 1, well, Malkuth of Malkuth, that's utter darkness, that makes sense. But if you flipped it and all of a sudden 1 was up here with Cinnabar, I mean, that would work too if you understand it's a series of transformations he's working with in all of these numerical orders that's going on. Okay, let's go back to the flip monad up here. That's the world before the fall. And so this is the world after the fall. We know his whole monad glyph is a stylized Mercury. So he gave you 4 different Mercuries. One is the monad glyph itself. One is the monad glyph without the dot in the middle. One's the monad glyph without the fire of Aries, which is our usual symbol of Mercury. And another is this one down here. And that was representing particular things in theorems 12, 13, and 14. So you can go back and correspond these things together here. For example, the easiest correlation would be that in the fallen world, Aries, the fire sign, is representing the fire, firing you up the middle pillar that he describes in terms of physical alchemy in a variety of metaphoric ways. But here you've got just the moon. Why? Well, you're in the first grade of the moon, and here you're in the second grade of the moon. From that, a series of other understandings flow. Why are we doing 1, 10, 100, 1,000 there? Oops, let me go back, hold on. But briefly, that's because, remember back in the letter to Maximilian. There we go. So back in the letter to Maximilian, you remember the Pythagorean Y, where we had a sequence like that, and allusions to Plato's Republic, and he was writing to Maximilian, but he might as well have been addressing you or your best and most noble self to take the right branch on that Pythagorean Y. So when you get to the next level, there above the horizon of time, what would you have? 10,000. In ancient Greek, the myriad, which can also mean an infinite amount of things. So what is above the horizon of time? That's a great question. See if you can answer it. And if you can, share your answers below, because there are many, many more answers you could give than the ones I'm giving here. But basically, one easy way to interpret the horizon of time here is when you are between the bottom two worlds and the upper two worlds on the tree of life, which, as you know, divides into four worlds. Let's go over here and look where he says the ancient enigma of the tenfold proportions explained, but there aren't 10, there are 8. Well, that's an easy one, right? The way he's equating 8 and 10, he has alluded to even in his drafting instructions, has one of his many kind of winks that he says, well, it can be uh, about a fourth or a fifth, and another time he says 8 and 10. You can divide both of them by 2, and he's making an equation of numbering by 8 and numbering by 10. The denary associated with the tetractys and the sephiroth on the tree of life, the 8 with the octave. And that allows you to bring in the magical 7, right? Because if if you play a musical instrument, that you have 7 notes and they repeat with the 8. So that's the octave. And in the Greek alphabet, the vowels correspond to those 7 notes. So how about down here when he is associating the elements with 4? Well, that requires another flip, doesn't it? Because we've seen in the Sefer Yetzirah how fire, air, and water don't exist until you get to Malkuth. That is, and only then in the world of Messiah. So this can't be the Sephiroth going up the tree anyway. Plus, you're supposed to be going up the middle pillar, and that'd be throwing you off to the side paths. So what is he doing here with these? Since it's 4, think of all the things he's equated 4 with, especially his cross of the elements, his rectilinear cross. You might also see that this explains, both here and frankly later in his Enochian work, some of the difficulties of associating elements to that cross, because the cross of the elements in the construction he gives you really only works in the world of Messiah. So you don't, for example, as you go up through the 4 worlds, associate water with the second world, air with the third. So there is anything beyond that I tell you would require us to take these numbers and put them in a particular context. We could do that, though. For example, we could associate these elements with the perfect forms in the Timaeus and come up with some rather interesting things. I'll come back to that. Now come over here. He's saying up here is the quaternary. Through enumeration, Harmonious keeps the Sabbath. Well, the Sabbath, what day of the week is the Sabbath? And Sabbath is associated with Saturday, the measurements. Saturn then is associated also with the Sephira Bina, which we've associated with the receptacle. So all these kinds of transformations, it's not really a difference. It's just more obvious here than for those of you who have studied, say, Agrippan magical correspondences. I think there's a tendency among people who use those, particularly in ceremonial magic, to make them real fixed in a way that, in my humble opinion, is more fixed than the actual world of Malkuth. So one of the things that we've seen him do often, a cynic can take it as sleight of hand. I think myself it is just brilliance, is he'll get to a point where a set of correspondences work and you don't know where they're going, and he flips them into something else. And he's done that again and again and again. Okay, so the quaternary, one thing we know is, by theorem 20, what's happened with the quaternary and the ternary? Well, they've merged, because the stone the builder rejected that was in the ternary is now up above. So in effect, we now have 2 quaternaries, or this bottom part more to the point, in 20 has just fallen away. So what do we get with two quaternaries? 8. That's the measure that you have here. But the part that is below the horizon of time in the fallen world, while time is still continuing, is down here. Here's the terrestrial. You can think of this as his double M, right where my cursor is there. We talked about that double M a lot with that graphic in 22. The celestial, the etheric, what's going on there? That's the path of the initiate that we talked about in 21 and 22, where your feet are in Malkuth. You're grounded, you're in the world where time still exists, where it's chaotic, but you're moving up etherically, astrally, energetically, the middle pillar of that tree. Here's one of the many things he's had ternary stand for, right? Body, spirit, soul. So it's your spirit and soul that are rising, like the Gnostic ascent of the one, like the repairing of the fallen vessels, and as Tikkun Olam, the Platonic restoration of the good, all of those things that we've discussed many times. All right. I talked also in that video on these charts before about these particular terms here. And as you can see, since this is super celestial, there is really no expectation that your etheric body is going to go higher than this horizon of time. But the idea is that you might have a vision of revelation. After all, that's what the book of Revelation is, right? A revelation. And see what is in effect the upper two worlds of the tree. Let's see. I think the things you have there at the bottom are the first part I've already talked about, but I wanted to talk about this number here, 25, and why we get suddenly 25. 22 made sense, number of letters in the Hebrew alphabet. 24, the number of theorems, number of hours in a day. There are lots of other significant reasons for 24. 6 times 4 connected to that important part of the book of Revelation. Okay, but what about 25? Well, you've probably seen the note at the bottom there already. Think of the section in the book of Revelation that Dee referred to in Theorem 20 and again in 24, where you have the 24 elders or seniors on their thrones rotating around Jesus, 24 and Jesus, that's 25. And if you want that to be the ultimate kind of magical idea, well, 25, 2 and 5 equals 7. Now, if even at this point, that just seems kind of silly rather than cosmic, probably this fusion of Pythagorean thought and gnosis and Kabbalistic mystical mathematics is not your thing. But we know by now how much it is these things. So for any of these numbers here, I would assume by now you've just looked at what are the properties, what it gets associated with the 3. Oh, a triangle, a tetrahedron, and so on. We talked about those things back in the first 10 theorems, but it's worth continuing to explore. Okay, so that's 25. Let's go down to 13. What about 13? Well, something else that we have seen Dee do, and we saw it more in those first 10, was when you get a kind of extra number, you put it in the center. So if you have 6 faces in a cube, you're in the center. That's the 7th. So you can do that same kind of thing with 13 with the dodecahedron, which is associated with that hidden element, ether, spirit. It's also has many interesting characteristics, which you can look up if you want. It's a star number. It's a centered star number. It corresponds to some very cool dates. Think of Friday the 13th and that kind of thing. It's a Fibonacci number following 5 and 8, but there's an even more hidden meaning. And you start to see this. You see it before Dee in artwork of Albrecht Dürer, who I've mentioned before, but you really start to see it in the Rosicrucian era just after Dee dies. 13 is associated with Ophiuchus, the 13th constellation on the ecliptic. In fact, the word Ophiuchus comes from the Greek for serpent bearer, so it can be and has been associated by some with people with the Ouroboros serpent. It's commonly represented as a man that is grasping a snake, sometimes Hercules struggling with the snake. And we've talked about what Hercules means in the myth of, well, in many myths in Dee's time. Ophiuchus is not a new constellation. It's one of the constellations Ptolemy mentioned, and we've seen Dee refer to Ptolemy's Tetrabiblios. It's one of the 88 modern constellations, but back then there were 48. So if you like 12s and 24s, then of course you like 48s. And it's a head and tail of the dragon. Those of you who are astrologers might know a certain association there with the head and tail of the dragon. Sometimes this Ophiuchus gets associated with a 13th sign of the zodiac. If so, it would have to be the zodiacal equivalent of intercalary days, because it messes up the other numbers of the zodiac. I mean, you're dividing 360 by 12, 30 degrees. 3, the ternary, is very important to him. So personally, although I have heard one person in particular talk about Ophiuchus as the 13th zodiac, and I really respect the work of that person, I think in terms of the kind of thought Dee has been developing, it just doesn't work very well. But you can look at Ophiuchus and the ideas connected to it, and the number 13 has a secret related to processional astrology, or the astrology of long world ages. And I'll tell you then why that would be a secret. As we've discussed briefly in other classes, Dee was really taken with the idea of long world ages. He thought that he was living in the age of Venus. The way that these world ages were usually calculated in Dee's time, and there's a variety of ways, but it's usually with sevens, like 7 weeks, jubilees, which is biblical apocrypha and heretical to begin with. But then if you go to a long world age, like how long it would take a point that is a fixed star to go to precess 360 degrees, that's a long, long time, almost 25,000 years. It goes 1 degree every 72 years. So you can just do the math on that. What would be the problem of that in Dee's time? Well, humans weren't supposed to have been around that long. That's the big problem with it. So any idea of precessional astrology that you see, and you see it obliquely in the works of many people, Tycho Brahe being one of them, by the way, it tends to be referred to indirectly, because otherwise if you are a doctrinaire Christian, you're backdating Genesis further back than is acceptable to most people in the church. Not to people who believe in evolution, by the way, but anyway, I guess I shouldn't have gone there, but I did. So 13 on the chart pushes us into a lot of concepts that you see a lot more in Renaissance artwork. You saw before Kepler's drawing of Ophiuchus in 1604. Here's Hercules and Ophiuchus. You can find a wonderful drawing of Ophiuchus and Azoth around. I probably should have put it on here, but I think you can find it on your own. So that brings us back here. Okay. The other thing that you would do is to see what Sephiroth, or combination of Sephiroth, would you associate with the horizon of time. And the way that makes most sense to me is looking at the horizon of time running right through the middle of the 2 upper worlds, the Atzluth, the Briatic, and underneath the Yetziratic, and the world of action. So that's as high as this goes. That's high enough for most of us. And I've already talked about why you might have difficulty with his attributions of air and water. There are other things that that we could talk about here if we wanted to, but I think what I would rather do is, if you have questions or you come up with other things, and there are many, like where are you going to put the planets in there? Where are you going to put the planets when the planets are gods and goddesses? Where would you put the archangels or choirs of angels associated with particular Sephiroth? If you want to take on any of those things and comment below, I promise I'll answer. But that's the end of the part of my class on the Monas Hieroglyphica where we are looking at the particular parts of the hieroglyphic monad itself as what we're exploring. I'll drop another video here in a couple of days and talk about what is going to come after this. I'm going to be gone for about a month because I also teach in person and I have a real intense class starting up in about a week. So I'm going to disappear from not answering your questions, but from making any more videos for a good month. Again, thank you so much for joining me through this course. It's been a real joy doing this, and it's blown me away to see how many of you were following along with me. So thanks again, and have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.